Well, it's become chilly again, this part of the woods. Always in the middle of August or beginning of September, you start feeling the little hints of winter. I used to rather be amused by it, but now I rather dread it, I must say. Anyway, so Paul says, love these. Tell us, we out here in IG land. IG land is Instagram land, I think, but that's where I got this question from. Tell us more about the visual order you speak of and why it matters. That is, why it's important, why it's such an important skill to develop. And on seeing this, I realized that I had talked a lot about it and described aspects of it, and particularly in terms of ways of working and that sort of thing, and showed you some of the things I do to get it. But I suppose there's a larger sort of theoretical discussion that could be had. And I'm making an attempt to do that. I'm going to try to cover 3 points that are in that larger sort of sense of things. If you want to say, to sort of outline it. So the world of the visual order. And the visual order, by the way, again, it's my expression. It's I think I read it in a and I've mentioned this before, in the Putfarkin book on composition, which is a pretty nice piece of work in terms of the history of composition. But it's talking about something around the 1600s, how and he uses the expression visual order. So I never took it to mean anything particular, but I think that word stuck in my head. Other people use other words. Meldrum says perceptual order. I never heard of Meldrum and his words for that stuff before. Before I'd done my own research, thus I had uncovered for my own purposes this way of thinking about the visual world. So, but let's just talk about it in 3 ways. Let's talk about the content of the visual world, and then the idea of relatedness, which is the management of the visual world, and then let's talk about this as a way of working, the visual order. There's a way of working that is like you could say there's the visual order, and then there's this way of working from the order in which we see things. But what is that order in the first place? So let's just talk about the content. And now this is just purely the content of the visual world, but let me skip this one for a second. I'm going down and looking at this photograph that you may have seen on Instagram. We took it in the studio. It's one of the Parthenon figures tying his shoes, looks like a soldier tying his shoes, with his head up, probably watching for the enemy. Sandals, whatever he would have been wearing. But in this image, you can actually see the beginning of what we call the visual content, right? So you can see that there's a gray and a yellow color. You see the overall, so shall we call this yellow? And this gray, you can see values. You can see maybe the lightest light, or certainly another light over here. You can see middle tones, and you can see darks, right? In fact, the entire portion of the bottom portion of this picture is a dark. And if you blow your eyes a little bit, you'll see it's a dark that really hangs together. And there's really, really dark middle tones, but they're middle tones in the dark end down here, which you can barely see. And up here, you can see middle tones in the light end that you can also barely see differentiating themselves from the world. So the world we see, we couldn't be able to see it all if we didn't have values, right? So that's the nature of the visual world. We need the values. Now the second part of that, by the way, is we can only paint with values, right? All we have is dark and light values, and of course we have color, but all we have is to put on a canvas is chunks of a value or color. I say chunks. I shouldn't even say that, but marks. And then we have what can happen with those things, visual content. So what you can see is, for example, that say that this dark mass here takes up 2/3 of the picture. Here's a dark mass. Here's a growth out of that dark mass. You could say this dark comes over. So you see the shape making that happens where dark meets light. There's a certain amount of shape making. This is a shape. It's a size. It's also a location, right? So this here is a shape. And this is a shape, right? And what we mean by a shape is a two-dimensional pattern. You wouldn't see shape if you didn't have a dark and a light, right? And And shape happens everywhere. There's just this dark right here. There's a shape, if you want to call it that. Now, shape is very complex if you think of it in many ways, but so shape is just two-dimensional pattern. However you see it, you can see, as it were, the shape here of this thing right here. But the most fundamental thing about painting is values. The most fundamental thing you have to know is that there is such a thing, for example, as darks and lights and middle tones and all these tones that land in between. Tones, we call them, right? Values. And another element, of course, is what we see. And I understand that I think it was in Rome, if not, and I'm talking about way old days, that they used to describe this as an art of color, what we do. It's classical, it's a classic expression. So, so color, obviously, the idea of color, and color has its own content, which is intensity, and values is a piece of, I think of it as a piece of the content. It's a color value is the way Hale put it, of the Vermeer book. So, but you begin to see what I'm saying, right? That's the visual content is just simply there. It's the stuff. It's the stuff that parallels what we do with our eyes. Our eyes see darks and lights in relative amounts and positions and all those things. And that's what we can do on a canvas. So it obviously behooves us to be thinking, I wonder if I can do that, And, so instead of thinking heads and bodies, we find ourselves in our world thinking darks and lights and objects, right? I mean, not darks and lights, but you would say darks and lights and value objects, value units instead of objects per se. So you'd think of this thing here, we're looking at here, as a relief, right? This is a bas relief. And this whole question comes up about, do you have to understand bas relief to paint a good one? And the next part of it is parts of this express human anatomy. And so the question is, do you have to study human anatomy to draw this? Well, and of course the Impressionist says no to both of them. And that's what leads to this idea that we're talking about now, the visual order. This is a scene from a movie that I've mentioned before. I think my producer has mentioned before, and he certainly is welcome to mention it again. One that he made as part of in relation to a film slam thing that I believe he won, and his group won. But this is just an outtake, a shot somebody took of those guys setting up the scene and working on different things. But in this visual thing here, you can see we have darkest darks, perhaps. And we can see, and we have lightest lights, which are somewhere in some of these different spots. Somewhere we're going to find the lightest lights. Maybe it's the balding head or what. And then there's all the middle tones in between. That's the nature of the world visual, right? It's values and it's color. And so the most chromatic colors are either this green up here or these reds. And then the next value, chroma, now it's intensity of color. And the next intensity down would be the blues. And you can see we go all the way down until we get to a color that we can't even quite make out. It's hard to figure out what color that is because it's so neutral. And so that's the range of intensities. That's the visual content as well, right? And then, of course, we've said before, you have the size of this mass. And anytime a mass has a shape quality, then you have the world of shape that you're dealing with. We have value gradation. Like from the shoulders here, getting mid-tone, getting darker, or say from this direction across here, maybe easier to see. There's a movement of values, and it produces the sensation of form, if you want to call it that. But it's a transition from a certain value of this value through another value to another value, right? So certain people would think of those as planes, but that's just a way of interpreting that stuff and rather reducing it to something. But it's value and value movement we're talking about. So you see what we wind up doing in our little old world here is we have those things. And so you see my second point is the crucial relatedness of these things, right? So what you have is elements, and then you have what they do in relation to each other, right? And that's just fundamental. That's the entire world is visual, is of that stuff. Everything we see is made out of those things. And so it's really the guy who can organize it best that actually will get you the most beautiful, the most truthful rendering of what you see. Beauty is another part of this discussion, but it's a more profound one, and let's talk past that for a moment, okay? So what you can see in terms of relatedness, for example, is you can see, shall we say, blues, and you can see a blue, and you can see some other blues, right? And there's a relatedness factor. In some of your images, this will appear as a blue as well. It's a one of those neutrals that has a blue quality. Where you see a neutral like this that has a yellow quality compared to that blue, to that what we'd call a blue. But at any rate, each of these blues can be seen as being part of the blue set, right? One of them, if you include this one, is the darkest. Another one may be the lightest. And so it'll go. One of them may be the most chromatic, probably this one, right? So what you're seeing now is the relatedness of these things. And if you can't get the relationships right of these notes to each other, then your skill level isn't adequate to do a master impression, okay? And that's obviously in the color world, but obviously in the world of lights, you need to know where your lightest light is. You know, is that this? Is that this? And so on. And or maybe even some of this. And so what you have is the values and the lightest light, and then you have what we call the darkest dark, which is probably, you know, somewhere between these three guys, just in the images I'm looking at it here, and I'm hoping it shows up similarly on your page. And every other value lands, shall we say, just between 1 and 10 on a scale. Once you choose the light you're going to work with, and you choose the dark you're going to make your darkest dark, everything lives in a relation to those things. Some of the middle tones will be closer to the darks by a lot. They'll almost appear to be the darks. This is maybe a nice example right here, where it rather disappears into this. Or here, where you can barely see the separation, but you can. This is slightly lighter. And then this darker middle tone here, too. Do you see how that is? So these darks are very close. These middle tones are very close to the darks, to the darkest darks. And then you'll find at the other end that some of these midtones, like this, or other ones of them, are pretty close to the lightest lights, okay? And there's this whole range, shall we say, from 1 to 10, you can say from 1 to 30, whatever the number is. One of the difficulties of this is we don't do it by the number. We do it by watching and feeling the relatedness of things, right? So there's a number of ways to do that, but side by side is one of the easiest ones when you're looking at a value, say this value here on this jacket, and you see that you can't find a silhouette between these two, you say, oh, those two are the same value. And then when you see a value, let's find another one that's close. Say this value right here and this value right here. What you're going to see, if they're going to make a silhouette, sometimes soft edge, sometimes hard. Edge, by the way, is just another one of those phenomena, right? What we mean is when a value meets a value, it has a joint, right? That joint is either what we call soft. It's not, Gamble used to hate that word, but he didn't offer us a better one. And he used it even sometimes. But there would be a softness, or there would be a sharpness, right? A more sudden ending to it. And the world is full of the relatedness of sharpness, right? But I was just beginning to say it's also relatedness of contrast, right? So you have high contrast, relatively high contrast. You have serious contrast, right? Here's contrast with sharp edge. Here's contrast with less sharp edge. Again, here's contrast that's a little bit lower with a sharp edge, and so it goes, right? So contrast, that's the way what happens where values meet. What we think of it as that, and what I call light effect, okay? So whenever I use the word effect, I'm talking about that feeling of glow that exists here when it's next to something darker. You can very easily have that sense, like this can look like a light here, this blue, shall we say, this bar. It can look like a light just at this edge where it touches that dark, dark, dark. But on the right side, it will become the dark, and this will become the glow. But there's a sensation of effect right there, what we call light effect. That's just my word, but it is those truths that have to be rightly related to each other. So this is a very weak effect, and again, the word contrast applies. This is a way stronger one, but nowhere near as strong as this one. So that's the relatedness factor, right? We also have a factor of well, we talked about intensity already. Say if we did the reds, you can see this red here, and it very much relates to a certain thing happening in here and on the face over here. And again, that's one of those things where Paxton wants you to make sure if it's in your brush, you look around to see if it shows up in other places, because that relatedness is a part of the unity factor. So, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the relatedness of stuff, right? So, blues are different from reds, are different from yellows, and blues. And so they relate that way. You can say this is, when I look at two different notes, I'd say, oh, that one's of that group I'm looking at. That's the red, this is the yellow, that's the blue, whatever. But it's just a way of getting your head around how they feel in relation to each other. And I tell students to please do that with your darks. Here's a very serious dark here. But what is it to this dark? And you can, it looks like, at least in my world, that in this view here, that this is, besides being darker than this one by a little bit perhaps, it's also redder. It's also a redder, yes, rather this one feels bluer. We really do try not to say whether it's red or not, because the relatedness is the only fact in the world we have here. But it's, do you see how it is, though, that the world of relatedness is a big world, and you really want to be good at it, right? In fact, what's going to happen is you're going to have some fun. You start having some serious fun when you start getting into the related world and stop being into realism. Realism is such a deadly dead end. I just acquired a new student, and he was telling me that he was losing his interest in painting, his love of painting, because of that element, dominating him, and does that mean that we are less true if we paint like a Boston School painter? Doesn't even mean it for a second. We're actually, in numbers of ways, more true than the noodler. But we're not necessarily as, what the right word is, hyper-modeled, tactile realism, but we are absolutely true. And the truth that you're talking about is the relational truth. So, and I suppose also the shape, size, angle, all those things are all functions. I mean, you're not a good painter of our type if you can't make a round object look round. But the way we approach it may be, and likely will be, entirely different. So you follow that. That's the thinking. That's the content of the world visual. Okay. So, and I'll just give you this. Vermeer's a wonderful conversation about it, right? But here you can easily see the world as when you look at the big ensemble, and that's what you always do in our world. You never look at parts and work up one part and then a second part and then a third part and then a fourth part and hope everything comes out okay. You actually always have to be in all the parts at once. Even when I think even most painters who work outlines, certainly in the Gamma model, you would draw all these things, you would trace them onto a canvas, and then you would block every one of these value units in and get their colors right to each other. So even if you're not doing it in visual order, you're still doing it relatedly, right? Which is the big deal. But here again, I'm just going to simply talk about the red, yellow, blue. So I'm hoping you have the same colors as I do on your screen. But you might argue you have easily three blues here, right? Blue, 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 and then you want to talk about whatever that is to the blues. Then you have obviously yellow. And this is this yellow, this yellow, this yellow, and some are warmer, some are cooler, some are richer, some are less so. And then you have the reds, which seem to pertain more. Well, that's arguable in this picture, but in any case, I was going to say they seem to pertain more closely to parts of the face, but it's possible they don't. Nevertheless, red, yellow, blue are distinctive colors, and you're trying to get those right in relation. You want to know what the most chromatic note is. Is it that on the edge of the table there? If it is, your picture has got to set that. Now, this whole world of anchoring, this is process stuff. This is how we do it. But it's also so that in the relational world, your most chromatic note needs to remain the most chromatic note. So there's this order that's visual that has to do simply with the idea that there is a most chromatic note. And so, it bridges the territory of colors, right? And values both. So this might be the second, or this might be the second, but that's where you're living, between these, maybe this one here. But you're living in this place where you're trying to figure out what the leading chromas are and make sure your chromas are well related to each other, okay? So that's the visual content. You'll find even in a typical day at North Light that the grays the wall will tend to be, if you're looking through on a blue day, will tend to be blue. The shadows will tend to be rather golden. That's a relationship that you want to see with your eyes, not just follow somebody's rule about it. Trying to stay warm, just saying. And then again, you have the relative sharpness of edge. So you get something like this. That's impressively sharp edge, also high contrast. And you'll have some other ones and some other ones. And you'll have, and they don't know, edges don't know values. So it's just like intensity doesn't know values and doesn't care about what color. There's going to be the most intense, is going to be the most intense. Well, edges are the same way. You might have the sharpest edge in your picture could be in a place like this. It could be a low contrast place because it might be, it could even be in a place like this where you can almost not see a difference. It could be your sharpest edge. But it's all, there's still a need for those edges to be right to each other just as much as there is for the values in a picture to be right to each other. So in the values world, you have the lightest light, and you have descending orders of light, right? And then you get all the way down to the darkest dark, which may be this or this, and certainly in this little range right here. And then you have all the world of middle tones, of which this is the dominant middle tone, right? And your skill, of course, has to be, can you get this world set so that it makes the lights sing, right? Can you get it set in such a way that the darkest darks and the lightest lights do this? And can you get it so that the whole package of the values, as we look at it, also does this big general impression and doesn't become just an inky picture? So there's this, that's the world, but that's the world of visual content. It's not that we don't understand that there are shadows and lights and things like that, but our world isn't shadows and lights. We can't paint shadows and lights. We can paint dark and darker. We can paint light and middle tone, but we can't paint shadows. Shadows is a product, right? And it's much like form is a product, by the way. You can move if you move your values well, you'll be expressing the form of the. So you have the pillow right here, right? If that's what that is, I can't tell what it is from here. But you'll be expressing the form if you actually have your lightest light doing the right thing and darkest dark, and then you actually can move that well. So that we're talking about this graduation of values, which is very real stuff. So in everything, of course, the world has that we wind up in. Once you've made points, locations like let's just say this one, and you've made a secondary one, say something like this one, you have angles, and angles are all over a picture, and angles have to be right to vertical. It's in the very nature of the location. I mean, not the location, but the articulation of angle. This is Sargent talking, points and angles of what? Of visual content, of dark silhouette and less dark silhouette. The points that they make being rightly regulated, rightly related to each other. Then, of course, they wind up making perhaps triangles. And all over this place, by the way, there are these 2 points and another point, and each one of these things is a visual phenomenon, right, in space. And the rightness of the dot relating, well, this dot here relating to, say, this dot here and this one here, all the time you're working, you're getting these things rightly related to each other, this to this to this, anything that shows up. One of the reasons, I'll talk about the why. But I got to remember, I'm afraid I'm going to forget to talk about the why. So let me get past that just for now. But let me just make a mention of it just for now. So I hope I remember it again. But what you're trying to do in our way of working is you're trying to express the world. Let's see if the next picture shows that. You're trying to express the world of as it presents visually, right? Not as it presents actually, but as it presents visually. You're trying to present that world. And so what that means, though, in our kind of a start, is that it gives us a reason. Let me just put it that way and say no more. It just gives us a reason to do our kind of a start. If you do outlines around everything, you're already false. As soon as you've covered the canvas, everything's false. There's no such thing in nature as an outline. So having said that, that means you're just not visual anymore. You may have derived that from the visual, but your mechanics are right now dominating the look of nature, right? And so what our way of working does is it gives you the look of nature to work with right from the beginning. So that's the sort of the follow-up that we're going to try to do in a few moments. And this is a nice example, though, of how much content you get when you see 2 edges. Say you see the readingness of this with a bit of a light with a sharpness, and the softness of this one. And you can see that this is a penumbra here. And we didn't have to have the science of penumbras in our hands. We just had to have the science of edge relationships in our hands. If you can make the edge contrast right here, if you can make this look the way it looks. And if you make this look the way it looks, just appearances, you will have the visual content. It's a funny thing, I try to tell students all the time that all you have really out there is objects like this, not real objects, just light objects, dark and light objects. Here's another one right here. And these objects make real shapes, and they exist in real sizes to other objects. And they have a visual orderliness, like this one here has the strongest effect. This is now the strongest light effect here. And it includes maybe the sharpest edge, certainly the area does. And then there's other aspects as you're working your way around where you're virtually lost into the next piece of information. In other places, you're lost into the next piece. But the visual content of that, I mean, the visualness of that, right? It's not about eyes. It's not about eyes at all. And our way of working says, let's talk about this. And that's why I say the Hale comrade is quite interesting. When he said we looked up and we're studying this Vermeer, and we realized he hadn't drawn an eye and colored it in. He had actually done a blob, and then added a darker blob to that blob. And suddenly he had an eye, and it was an eye made out of spots, right? Value spots. And that's what we mean by spots, by the way. These are value units, spots. We mean more than that at times, but that's fundamental. So, yeah. But the collating, that's what I'm saying about organizing it. The collating of this edge to this edge is what gives you all kinds of things, including depth, including the sense of depth. Notice the nose here, how sharp it is, and this how less sharp, right? And yet normally you'd see somebody drawing those as being exactly the same. By the way, the noodler will get to that eventually, but the guy who sees visually will articulate this first, and when he gets to this, he immediately will righten it to that. He will compare it with this, righten it. That's a good one. All right. But in every case, that's what will happen. You articulate this silhouetting little spot right here. You'll do that contrast, and you'll compare that contrast to this contrast. You'll compare that edge to the world of edges wherever they appear and get them right to those things. That's the world that we live in, the world of relatedness of what? Purely visual phenomena. The relatedness of values, the relatedness of colors, and the relatedness of edge and effect, okay? So here's Vermeer being that model, like the wonderful model of this that he always has been. But so in this one here, let's just look at the normal thing, which, now again, this picture is not really great because it looks like all these darks are black, and so it's one of those reproductions you can't do much about. But so it's hard to talk about the darkest dark and the lightest light, but it's obvious that we're talking about the lightest lights being a certain set of them. And they have a distribution. They distribute themselves through the picture in such and such a way. So that's the relatedness of them. So they live on, say, an angle from here to this arm, from this waist here up to the reading edge of this arm. We can easily grasp that there's an angle sense. And also to any point up here, including either this point, some other point, or even the whole of this ball, we can get the angles right between these points. And we can get the tilt, shall we say, of the triangle created by these points. Well, that's just visual stuff that happens when you articulate an effect. You wind up with triangles, things like that, which my studio thinks of that as the arabesque, not the way Gamble described it, not particularly the way Gamble used it. That's what I should bring up and talk about with Mr. Dunley one of these days again. Anyway, so here again you have the colors. Here's the greatest mass of color, the big one, and there's a middle-sized mass. I'm talking about red. And then it weakens out at some weaker reds and getting smaller sort of as it heads this way. The whole world is like that. Once you begin to see relationally, what you're really interested in is the play of these reds to each other, the play of these lights to each other, the play of the blues to each other, and any other sets, by the way, classes, sets, edges are sets, light effects are sets, and so on. So, so where to go? Let me just let you look again at the list. So tell us again more about this visual order. I'm going to tell you more about that in the pictures I just put up there, and why it matters, why it's such an important skill to develop. And my point here is now I'm going to begin to talk about it right away as a way of working. But again, each one of these pictures, I'm going to go through it as content of the visual world, then the crucial relatedness of things, and then I'm now going to get into this idea of the way of working. So let me do these. I think right after this I show you the way of working. I show you some starts. So But what you can see in this setup right here, this is Tarbell, this is DeCamp. What you can see in both of these is the dominance of that. They have the first effect, and it does this dominating thing. So that's what you're going to be talking about, say, this area right here. And in both cases, it seems to be the collar area. Now, that's the first effect in this painting, and so it has an absoluteness, and you're trying in your best way of getting around this thing as a way of working now. You're trying to say, let me set that up and get that quality, that effect with really wonderful quality, and I'll build my painting out from that, right? Well, it isn't quite as simple as that, but in one sense, visually, just in terms of the values, it is that simple, right? So we wind up we can put a note down there all day, but we've actually got to get a note, touching a note, producing with an edge, the look of nature at that spot. But that presumes that all the other values have been thought about too, or at least you must do them soon after. But we also have the issue of intensity, right? So we have to do this head. It's this peachy, shall we say, tone, moving from a redder thing to a more golden one, much like a peach. And so we need to find out what it's going to take to make that happen in the circumstances of these other values that are sitting there. And that red, of course, to be good, has to be rightly related to any other reds and so on to be set up well. And again, so now you're talking about the first effects, the second level of effects, which is through here, and then third levels, right, some of which will be up there and other ones will be just spotted around in different places in the picture. But there are these levels of effects that I prefer to think of rather like bas relief, right? There's this first series of bumps that if you rub your hand across it, you'll feel. And then there's this whole secondary level of bumps. And that has to do with the relative projectiveness towards yourself. What happens when you do contrast is you get that sense of things coming towards you and other things receding. So a big part of this picture is, shall we say, lost, right? Recessive. It stays back. Low contrast stays back. High contrast stays forward. We see contrast as purely visual content, shall we say, because we put a dark next to a light and we produce that. And we see it producing an effect, and we have a sort of an orderliness of those things. So when we're doing relatedness, some people would say we're trying to make a flat picture, but we're really trying to we are always thinking of this picture as if it were already flat, but we're not trying to flatten out the world. We're trying to articulate the world the way it presents. But if you didn't design it well, it won't design well. If you didn't design it well in a frame, it won't look flat in the right sense of that word, in the proper sense of that word. That's a whole discussion for another day. If somebody wants me to, they can ask. But yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that one. But again, you're in the same category here. You have to anchor yourself to your light, to your best colors, your richest color notes, the ones that are going to make this sing like nature does. And these various ones, including the hands, have that quality. So you have to do that. You anchor yourself, of course, to the darkest dark and lightest lights. And you're anchoring yourselves in a secondary way or whatever kind of a way as you go along to the power of this effect as it compares, say, to the power of that, to the power of this or whatever, and any other effects as it reduces down. Oh, I know what I was talking about before. This whole idea, somebody, often people express some perturbation at the idea of lost and found, like it's a gimmick, but actually it isn't a gimmick. It's actually literally the physical order of things. Some things, chiaroscuro is not a gimmick. Chiaroscuro is real. Things have a really low contrast, and that's the obscure area, low contrast, but they tend to not appear. They tend to, or at least if they appear, they don't cut to your eye as fast as the other ones do, and especially as fast as that one does. That's just fundamental to organizing the stuff we do. So, yeah, I don't know how much more I can say about that, but I'll just show you quickly these guys. This is a sergeant here. And you can see here, he's got contrast here and here. He's got contrast in a number of places. Far lower contrast here. But the difference is he's doing the sharp edges in some of these places and softer edges in others. So he's always doing a relatedness of edges. He's always doing relatedness of values. This value, or this appears to be your dark, and this is secondary. He's also doing color relatedness. But that's the order of things, right? And so, yes, when you're working, this thing here winds up being very important in terms of a process because it's very important in terms of the final result. So the process you want to set that point up. It's important to be in the right place. So you might actually design your composition around locating that spot. in a significant way. It will be a big player, and it needs to be articulate. It needs to be said the way it's said. So the why is starting to come through. I think if you can say that what we're doing is we're actually not trying to present a person, we're trying to present the visual world in its grand ensemble, understood as a visual impression, then we actually have no choice but to order things according to their values, according to their effects, dark light, which includes edges, and according to their colors. And then finally, of course, according to distribution on the page. So he's taken great pains to make sure this exit is in the right place. He's certainly taken pains to locate this in the right place. The top here, I'm sure, has been thought through, including the exits here. This has all been thought through, right? So but the reason you do it is because you're trying to actually set up for your eyes to see the world visual as it presents in its most significant ramifications, in its most significant places and ways. So your emphasis whenever you're doing this, no matter what you do up here, is going to be on articulating the heck out of that, or over here it'll be on this, and on here it'll be this spot right here, and you'll see that necessity as you go along in terms of, because those are the players that exist in the first wave of content. I'm really getting long, so let me just run the rest right through this. I'm going to skip that one. I know you'd rather I didn't. I wanted to jump to this one. This is this is a Benson on the left and a decamp on the right, a study for one that we see a bigger version of eventually. But this is a wonderful expression of a place where you don't have to paint. So this is the lost area here. The hair is lost into the sea. Many passages here are not dealt with, right? On the other hand, this one is. And so some people actually will be in the mindset of, well, that's just a boat edge. What does that matter? These are people, you know. But in reality, in the visual world, we blur our eyes way down. And why do we do that, though? It's because we're trying to establish the visual order. And so it's the order of these effects that is the world visual, right? It's not the fact that it's a boat. The angle may matter, the edge will matter, the light effect will matter, and it will matter because it's part of an ensemble of these kinds of effects. And if you're actually talking about what makes beautiful, what makes for beauty in painting, we're talking about this play, color to color, like the color scheme here with the blue and just the right reds for that blue, you know, for that blue, or the interplay of the blues in this big world and the golds in relation to each other and all that sort of thing. That's our world. So everything we do is, and this is the why, everything we do is to get the game out there that makes this thing beautiful. Which is why I tell students, don't even think about picking up your brush if you haven't seen beauty yet. If you haven't found the reason to be there that has everything to do with the aesthetics, and that is to say, the music of the visual world, right? And the music of the visual world isn't the fact that it's a boy standing there, maybe fishing or whatever he's doing. Oh, and a girl, both fishing, one off one side and one off the other. So if you follow me, what makes this beautiful has nothing to do with what they're doing, right? Subject is irrelevant and it's not necessary. To quote Alfred Stebbins, subject is not necessary. So whenever you see docents in the museum, remind them of these great quotes, would you? Just tell them that subject isn't necessary. What do they make of this picture when they don't do subject? You know, is that a tear in the dog's eye? You know, that sort of stuff. But if you can follow that, this is a supreme example of something that's just set up. You know, and you could say that he's just set up the major play of color, masses, and effect, and, you know, and a few things that play, and as they play, including the effect of lostness, and all of a sudden you can see there's already music there. And this has got nothing to do with a trick. This has nothing to do with some device about lost and found. The fact is he went straight for what makes this picture tick, what makes this picture, what gives you a reason to do this picture. Some of which, by the way, is composition, so don't misunderstand ever that that's a factor here. We're always, as it were, looking through a viewfinder. And so you can do these tricks all day, but if you don't know how to compose a picture, you're not going to do well with them. So why would we do that? Well, because we're making music, and the music is here. It's not in the realism at the end of the day. So I'll give you that. I'll send you back to that painting by Paxton and let you see where this can go. It can go here. As I said, I've copied pictures just like this with this amount of realism. And I've copied them right through from the lay-in, just the way you saw it by Dick Benson, all the way to this. In the Benson is where you set up the visual order and the major players, and you organize your abstractions to perform the composition, and then to just simply perform the beauty of their relationships by color, by effect, by intensity, and all those other things you have. So that's the sort of underlying stuff, and I hope that's enough for now, Paul. And I do mean to come back and talk, because in the intensives I've just done, it became clearer and clearer to me that people need to understand the basic stuff you need to know to do this, and separate it from how to do this, right? And so another time, I'll try to capture that for you, all right? In the meantime, I'm totally out of time. For you people who love long ones, I'm thrilled to be of service to you. And to the rest of you, just share, comment, and subscribe, and keep on donating as much as you can. We still haven't quite, we're about halfway to paying off what we've done already. So very much appreciated that you've done that for us. And so I look forward to seeing you again in the next video, okay?